You've probably already heard these statistics. 8 people control more wealth than the poorest half of humanity combined. In advanced countries, wage gains for the top 1% have almost trebled over the same time as the bottom 90% struggled to keep up with inflation. And even the poor old megacorporations are feeling the squeeze. Yeah, that's right, the record-breaking stock market that has driven a lot of this inequality is itself more unequal than it has ever been before. The 20 most valuable companies in America are now worth more than every other public company combined, and it gets worse internationally. Just Nvidia alone is worth more than every single public company listed here in the UK, and we are the second largest financial market in the world. Now, I know all of this probably isn't a huge shock to you anymore, and that's exactly the point. It seems like no matter which way you look, inequality is only getting worse. And for as long as we can remember, it's only ever been getting worse. But it can't go on forever, right? Well, history might beg to differ. The Roman Empire, the modern global economy, the Soviet Union, colonial Europe, capitalism, feudalism, socialism, tribalism, it might not really matter. Throughout the ages, there have always been the elites, and everybody else. The only thing that changes is what everybody else gets in return for going along with it. They get to keep their jobs, their homes, their heads, take your pick, but the nature of inequality hasn't changed, only its trade-offs. To fix the problem, we need to understand the problem, or else we are bound to make the mistakes of the past. Even simple little ideas like family wealth on average disappears within 3 generations is mostly just simply wrong. But these all too common misunderstandings still shape our belief of dynastic wealth in the modern day. Maybe deep down we assume that eventually the guillotine will come back into style again as we reach some kind of breaking point. But almost every time we have tried that, it's only made things worse. Well, except for that one time.
The global economy is broken, Oxfam says in a new report which finds 8 billionaires own as much wealth as the poorest half of the world's population.
Most Europeans at the time were subjects of Rome. There's an immensely rich, powerful, very small ruling class and a very high degree of inequality.
In Stalin's Russia, so many members of the old bourgeoisie were hounded, persecuted. They could lose their lives just for being quote-unquote bourgeoisie in the Marxist.
Inequality is incredibly difficult for historians to study for 3 simple reasons. The first is that it's really hard to compare levels of wealth over different time periods. Someone like Augustus might have personally owned all of Egypt as his personal property, but even still, most of you wouldn't trade your modern life with him because of the conveniences and comforts you would be foregoing. And I just gotta say, I am so proud of you guys. Part of being a good student of history is appreciating how much most of history sucked. The second problem is that levels of wealth are really hard to compare within our own time period. Modern wealth is normally measured using net worth. You take the value of everything you own and subtract the value of everything you owe. Simple enough, but it can, frankly, lead to some pretty dumb results when addressing inequality. To use a personal anecdote, fresh out of my postgrad, which I wisely decided to do in a different country, I had a net worth of about negative $80,000. Fortunately, Big Daddy How Money Works looked after us, so it's not a problem now, but at the time, that technically made me one of the poorest people in history, since medieval serfs couldn't exactly take out student loans. This has raised the argument that maybe the reason inequality under capitalism looks so bad is because, at least partially, it's just a lot easier to measure inequality when everybody keeps a detailed inventory of their personal property. So what we really need is a better way of measuring wealth across very different populations and very different time periods that doesn't resort to crude adjustments for inflation. Now stick with me here, but the best way to do that might be to look at how much energy different people consume over their lifetimes. Energy usage is almost perfectly correlated with consumption in the modern world and throughout recorded history, meaning a unit of energy is almost a perfect stand-in for a unit of consumption. Heating, cooling, communications, transportation, it all takes energy, and so does manufacturing stuff. To collect resources, turn them into something useful, and then ship it around the world, it's all energy. If we can use a unit of energy like a joule as the basis of comparison, it solves a lot of problems when it comes to measuring inequality. The first is how it deals with debt. Having more debt than assets might technically give you negative net worth, but that doesn't mean you are really worse off than somebody that truly has nothing. What this method simplifies is what debt actually does. It just moves around the time you get to use your resources. And again, consuming resources is highly correlated with consuming energy. If, for example, you take out a loan to buy a house, you get access to a lot of resources right up front. But as you lose part of your income to paying off that debt over the following years, you will need to consume less than you could have without making those repayments. The second problem this method solves is the true value of wealth. Sure, Elon Musk might be worth $450 billion on paper, but as many people will point out, if he actually sells all of his assets, which are mostly stocks in various hyped up companies, their market value would tank, meaning he would only realize a fraction of that value in cold hard cash. To make matters worse, if he tried to spend all of that cash acquiring other resources like land, gold, elections, or other companies, their value would spike. But by just looking at the resources he could gain access to over his lifetime thanks to his paper wealth, it accounts for these financial realities automatically. The third advantage, most crucially for a video about history, is that by comparing energy usage, we don't need to crudely try and work out a foreign exchange adjustment between ancient Rome and the modern world. Baking a loaf of bread uses roughly as much energy now as it did back then. Okay then, so how much energy did the ancient Roman Empire use? Well, the good news is, far smarter people than me have already figured that out for us. The bad news is, it involves a little bit of maths. Paolo Melanima is an economic historian who wrote a paper that worked this problem backwards. He knew that as a baseline, humans needed between 2 to 5 gigajoules of energy every year to survive and do the labor-intensive work they were doing. This translates to around 1,300 to 2,600 calories per day, which is not a lot, especially for people toiling fields, but that was the reality. One thing you need to remember is that for most of human history, almost the entire economy of even the most advanced empires was dedicated to growing enough food to keep people alive. And after that was done, there wasn't much time or energy left for much else. This is also the reason why land originally had value. It was a way to harvest energy. Back then, they didn't have solar arrays or wind turbines that needed wide open fields, but they could use crops or pastures to do effectively the same thing. Crops collected energy from the sun and turned it into energy that could be consumed by people. Over time, the economic use of land as a speculative asset has changed, and believe me, we gotta talk about that. But this is how it all started. The more land an empire had, the more people it could feed, the bigger army it could assemble, and the more land it could conquer. Of course, food wasn't the empire's only source of usable energy. Livestock was also used as mechanical power to haul carts and plough fields. Meat was a luxury for most people because it was a very inefficient source of calories, so most animal food was turned into animal work. Melanima calculated this to work out to 2 to 5 gigajoules per person as well. The animals needed more food than the average human, but there were fewer of them to feed. The final source of energy was firewood. It varied by region, but the average Roman burned between 4 to 9 gigajoules of firewood every year for warmth, cooking, metalworking, and, of course, it was Rome, so bathing as well. One of the limitations that held back economic expansion was that the cities didn't have enough fuel to burn, and the empire often struggled with widespread deforestation. Added up, the average Roman was consuming between 8 and 19 gigajoules of energy a year between food, fuel, and the work of their animals. That is about the same as some of the poorest third world countries today, which makes sense since much of sub-Saharan Africa, for example, still relies primarily on basic fuel sources and livestock. By comparison, the average American uses about 275 gigajoules of primary energy every year, which doesn't include energy from food. Now, the average American is clearly eating more calories than the average Roman, but not enough to really make a huge difference at this scale anyway. And you know the average American doesn't want to talk about a scale, am I right? What makes this method really interesting is that the comparable GDP per capita lines up almost perfectly with other estimates from people like Walter Scheidel and Stephen Friesen in their research published in the Journal of Roman Studies. They used a different technique based on the value of wheat, but still arrived at basically the same economic figures. So then, we have worked out what the average person's resource consumption was, but what about the people at the very top? According to various publications, Emperor Augustus had a household staff of between 500 to 2,000 people to handle cooking, cleaning, entertainment, and administration of the staff themselves. Some of these were slaves, and some positions in service to the royal household were highly coveted. And on top of this, we need to include into our calculations that only the hours they spent working should be counted towards the emperor's personal consumption. This also doesn't include his Praetorian Guard, which were primarily responsible for his personal protection and could be counted towards his own personal resource usage as well. What's more is that by most accounts, Augustus, despite being arguably the wealthiest Roman emperor on paper, actually lived pretty modestly. Some of his successors, like Nero, would develop far more lavish palaces and household staff taking from the public treasury to fund their own personal consumption. Just by these historical accounts, the emperor at the time would consume about 500 to 2,000 times more resources than the average Roman, primarily to feed the people who personally served them, heat, light, and construct much larger dwellings, and fill them with fine, crafted wares from artisans across the empire. So how does that compare to a modern billionaire? Well, Elon Musk has the largest net worth on paper of anybody in the world currently, but in terms of the actual resources that he has claimed for himself, meaning they can't be used by anybody else, by far his biggest splurge is private air travel. Musk's 2 Gulfstream jets were tracked logging a total of 881 hours in the air in 2024, according to public flight data. Ignoring the depreciation on the highly technical aircraft and concentrating exclusively on the fuel, that would equate to a total energy consumption of 62,000 gigajoules, or about 2,500 times more than the average American, or 7,000 times more than the average global citizen. And that's just the fuel. If we include the resources that are spent manufacturing an item that will eventually need to be scrapped, spare parts, staff, ground crew, then the actual consumption could easily be double that. Musk uses his jet a lot, but there are also thousands of these aircrafts across the world serving thousands of billionaires. And don't get me started on how many resources go into keeping super yachts afloat. So when compared to a handful of monarchs spread across the ancient world, it's very clear that the world is spending far more of its resources on a small group of elites today than it has at any point in history. But is that actually a problem? Sure, these guys are using far more resources than any other humans in history, but there are also far more resources to go around, right? Well, it's time to learn how history works to find out why inequality only ever gets worse. Today's episode is sponsored by Brilliant. Brilliant is a powerful learning platform built around the idea that the best way to understand something is to do it. With thousands of interactive lessons in math, science, and computer science, it helps you build real intuition through problem solving, not passive watching. One course that really stood out to me is scientific thinking. It digs into how we form models of the world, test ideas, and challenge assumptions. Basically, the same tools historians and scientists use to make sense of the past. It's not a history course, but it sharpens the kind of thinking that history actually depends on. I've been working through it myself, and it's made me look at historical analysis differently. You start with basic logic puzzles and end up evaluating evidence, spotting bias, and asking smarter questions. It's surprisingly relevant, and honestly, pretty addicting. And the best parts? You can do it in your own time. Whether you've got 5 minutes between errands or an hour to dig deep, Brilliant fits around your schedule. So if you're curious about how we learn from the past, or you just want to level up your thinking, Brilliant is a great place to start. To learn for free on Brilliant, go to brilliant.org/howhistoryworks, scan the QR code on screen, or click on the link in the description. Brilliant's also given our viewers 20% off an annual premium subscription, which gives you unlimited daily access to everything on Brilliant. Now, the third problem that comes with tracing the history of inequality is politics. Yeah, I know, disgusting. But throughout modern history, in nations where the people have a say, there have always been two opposing views. One side argues that inequality is necessary to guide the free market, spur individual initiative, motivate innovation, and encourage calculated risk-taking, so that society as a whole can flourish based on rational self-interest. If you invent the steam engine, you should get rich, which is great for you, but it also means that society will benefit from heavy industry and mass transportation, which is also good for everybody. The opposing view is that inequality actually stifles those very same principles. People can't make big contributions to society if they never receive an education or get access to basic tools and are instead focused exclusively on putting a roof over their head and food on their table. Now, the annoying thing is that both sides of this argument are technically correct in their own way. However, modern politics has made it so that rational compromise between these points is incredibly difficult to find. Capitalism is either the root of all evil, destined to destroy itself, or it's the very reason why America is great, Britain is just okay, and Europe is terrible. Here is a question for you. What is capitalism? If you are brave enough, you can leave your answer in the comments below. But historically, it's a system that has involved a lot of compromise and careful planning. Even Adam Smith, the grandfather of capitalism, said as much extensively in his writing. He believed that kings and lords just living off their land wasn't getting society anywhere, so the world needed a new system. He believed the most effective way to maximize the wealth of nations was to let people specialize in what they were best at and then trade with other people who would also specialize in what they were best at, so that the people could be rewarded for doing one thing really well. As long as there was a free and fair market system to facilitate trade, people could be confident that they would have access to everything they needed to survive, even if they dedicated their entire working week to just making tools, while someone else focused on farming. However, Smith was adamant that those markets needed to be free and fair. If they weren't, then people would just corner vital resources and charge more than the value they were providing, with a tactic that would later go on to be called rent-seeking. If this happened too much, then this new system of capitalism would just repeat all of the same problems that came from lazy lords living off their land, never wanting to change anything. If you actually read his work, the grandfather of capitalism said a lot of things that would probably get him called a radical socialist in your average YouTube comment section. And that's because the definition of what capitalism is has kind of been lost to time. Free markets, free trade, and free enterprise don't belong to capitalism, and neither does inequality. The original idea of capitalism was honestly far more boring and technical than you think. It was simply that people could own capital and be rewarded for that ownership. For this purpose, when early economists like John Locke, Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and even Karl Marx spoke about capital, they meant revenue-generating assets with the exception of land. Cash, machinery, tools, fuel, and even intellectual property are all categorized as capital. And what capitalism is supposed to do is enable the private ownership of this stuff with the expectations that its owners will want to improve their tools and therefore maximize output for themselves and society. For example, a lord on a farm with 19th century technology could only do so much to improve crop yields. But a factory owner adopts new technologies, fine-tunes production lines, and mandates more overtime from their child labourers. These improvements drove the Industrial Revolution and created a new class of elites, the capitalists. Though, to be fair, a lot of these early capitalists were also nobility, since they were more often than not the only ones with the resources to invest into industry. but a rising tide lifts all boats. The only reason why someone like Elon Musk can use more energy than the entire Roman Empire in a year, shuttling himself and his entourage around the world on a private jet, is because the world invented jets, which meant it also invented air travel and refined hydrocarbons and high-tech manufacturing and radio communications. All of these capital technologies have enabled the wealthiest people in the world to pull even further ahead of everybody else. No matter how many of Rome's resources an emperor claimed, he was never going to be able to build a Gulf Stream. But improving capital has also helped you and I live far more comfortable lives, even if we are further behind today's elites. Throughout most of history, land was the decider of wealth, and that wealth was limited because, well, we can't make more land. Well, unless you count those silly islands in Dubai. Either way, today the landed aristocracy has given way to the capitalists who source their wealth from other assets that, in theory, make us all wealthier. But that shift hasn't come without its own trade-offs. When the wealth of an empire's elite was literally tied to the physical land of the empire itself, it meant that they had some obligation to the system that elevated them in the first place. Land is scarce. Land is also immobile. But an increasing share of modern capital is just digits on a screen that can literally be transported anywhere. This has made inequality much harder to control because today's global elites don't need to manage their own empires. They can just move to whatever nation will give them and their capital the best home. So the real question is, how far does inequality have to go before it no longer encourages these kinds of improvements and instead starts squashing them? Well, the important thing to remember is that for most of history, this debate didn't really matter. Before representative democracies, rulers didn't need to sell the idea of inequality so long as they had a greater military force than those who would challenge them. They could legitimize the inequality by calling it a divine right to rule and offering protection to their subjects. But it really did come down to whoever had the biggest stick. Unsurprisingly, when their place in the hierarchy of humanity was secured, the drive to innovate was not nearly as strong. This changed in the Age of Enlightenment, when great thinkers started questioning the long-held status quo of humanity. Questions like, who says the king's son gets to rule? What if all men are created equal? Why don't we let markets decide? What happens if we put them in the guillotines instead? All fair questions. And it opened up some of the most important variables in the study of inequality: social mobility. Social mobility is the ability for people at the bottom of the wealth spectrum to rise to the top if they work hard, improve their skills, invest carefully, make contributions that are valued by a market system, or just get really lucky. Now, you can say a lot about inequality in the modern world, but social mobility has undoubtedly improved since ancient times, where your position in society was decided by your birthrights. If you were born a peasant, you were almost guaranteed to die a peasant. Today, there are no such guarantees. It's probably not going to happen to you, but you could build a business or land a job that propels you into the global 1%, where even just 200 years ago, that was a closed club. But that's been an anomaly rather than the expectation. The other side of the social mobility coin is that the wealthiest people also need to be able to lose their spot at the top if they get complacent, misuse their capital, or are just generally wasteful. There is an old anecdote that I'm sure you have probably heard about families going from rags to rags within 3 generations. The first generation makes a fortune, the second generation grows the fortune, and the third generation squanders the fortune. It makes sense since you don't see families like the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, or the Carnegies anymore, but it's actually based on absolutely no real data whatsoever. At best, this idea traces its origins back to a small, informal, and misquoted study from the 1980s, which found that family businesses typically only last 3 generations. But businesses and fortunes are not always the same thing. And besides, the 1980s were a very opportune time to run such a study in the first place. Several wealthy families across Europe can trace their lineage back centuries across dozens of generations. A study in Florence, Italy, for example, found that families who were wealthy in the city 600 years ago were still the wealthiest family in the city today. Literally, as I was writing this video, details of a juicy story dropped about one of the heirs to the Hermes family fortune, who had lost almost his entire $15 billion fortune, allegedly, to a financial advisor who was embezzling his money. He was a fifth-generation descendant of Thierry Hermes, who first started the luxury goods company 188 years ago. By all accounts, the heir had not worked a day in his life since leaving school in the 1960s and took no interest in even managing his own money, which is partially why he allegedly didn't realize it was slowly going missing. Now, of course, this particular line of family wealth has now ended, but if he hadn't made such a careless mistake, there is no reason why $15 billion couldn't have lasted for several more lifetimes. For our purposes, if that isn't the perfect example of a useless Nepo baby having access to resources they don't know how to effectively manage, then I don't know what is. Across the world, where we have reliable historic data, family wealth on average lasts far longer than 3 generations for 2 different reasons. Back in the age of hereditary estates, fortunes would pass from one heir to the next, keeping most of the fortune intact until some outside force, like a war or a revolution, put an end to it. In fact, one of the conditions that was implemented after the French Revolution was strict inheritance laws, which forced equal division of estates between children, rather than the tradition of the entire estate going to a single heir. This slowly dispersed wealth over time, instead of keeping it concentrated in a single lineage. France became the exception that proved the rule. In today's age, family wealth passing to a single heir is not illegal, but it has fallen out of fashion. The only difference is now, family fortunes can grow faster than the families can. Sam Walton, the founder of Walmart, was once the richest man on earth. In 1985, he was worth $23 billion. Adjusted for inflation, that would be $64 billion today. An impressive fortune, don't get me wrong, but significantly less than his 4 children, who are now worth more than $120 billion each. They have also diversified outside of owning the world's largest retailer. So even if Walmart ceased to exist tomorrow, they would still be some of the richest people on earth, easily outlasting the family business. This applies to lesser multimillionaires and billionaires as well. If market returns are greater than economic growth, then the people who own the market are always going to stay ahead of those working in the economy. For the last 100 years in a country like America, market returns have averaged just under 10% per annum, where economic growth has been around 4%. In places like Europe, the gap is even wider. We never used to split up family fortunes, and now we simply can't split them up fast enough. Either way, the old adage about wealth coming and going within 3 generations just doesn't hold up in reality. So then what happened to the family fortunes of the Rockefellers or the Vanderbilts? Why aren't they still around today? Well, there are actually 2 reasons for this. The first is that, believe it or not, they are still around today. Almost 100 years after John D. died, his great-grandson, David Jr., is still a multi-billionaire. The fortune has been split up over hundreds of heirs, but market returns have generally outpaced family growth. Their fortunes have also become so diversified and secretive that outlets like Bloomberg, Forbes, or Fortune magazine can't accurately keep track of how much they are worth like they could with someone like Jeff Bezos, who owes most of his wealth to a single, easily trackable public stock. However, they are certainly a lot less wealthy than the families that came after them, like the Waltons, despite having more time to compound their wealth. The real reason that these families got wiped out was inheritance taxes and trust busting. Between 1940 and 1970, America had some of the highest interest taxes in the world. For large fortunes, the government would take as much as 77% of the estate before it was passed down to children, and there were very few ways to get around it. Family fortunes between these times couldn't just count on market returns alone, which meant families either had to take more risks with their capital, or accept that they wouldn't stay wealthy in perpetuity just because they happened to inherit a lot of income-producing assets. The aftermath of the Second World War was one of the few times in history where inequality fell. In Europe, this was because a lot of the capital that made wealthy families wealthy was destroyed or used up in the war effort. Now, fixing inequality by literally leveling the playing field and making everybody start from scratch probably isn't going to be an easy sell at the best of times. But it didn't even really work long term. The elite families were made poorer, but they still had a larger share of the pie and they were able to concentrate their wealth as Europe rebuilt. Today, a majority of European billionaires inherited their wealth, and in a country like Germany, family lineages often have to contend with some questionable previous business decisions. But in America, there was no such destruction. Inequality fell because of deliberate policies to crack down on big businesses that had caused problems like the Great Depression, and policies to support young people returning from the war. Taxes on inheritances and large incomes were high, but support for average workers was strong. Wealthy people in these years were also innovating because R&D was more tax efficient than playing financial games with stock buybacks. But this all slowly changed back just a few years later. A few small decisions had an impact so big we can literally see it across dozens of historic macroeconomic data points. So what the fuck happened in 1971? Go and watch this video next to find out why we unsolved inequality. And don't forget to like and subscribe to keep on learning how history works.